Hello, everyone. So I'm going to start with a little bit about me. So each woman in science starts out as a kid, right? And when I was this age, I wanted to be a ballerina, and then maybe an actress, and then maybe a detective, but mostly an actress. But fundamentally, we're the sum of all of our experiences. And it took a really long path to get to where I am today. But every step that I took along that path, even the difficult ones and the quirky ones and the complicated ones, all led me to where I am. So wherever you start, there are so many different ways that you can go. So I'm interested in social life. And thinking about life and sociality, you can have it in all sorts of different forms, right? You can have really loose and uncommitted interactions, and you can have really highly interdependent cooperative units. And how does evolution build that? How do you have not just cooperation, but commitment? Not just sharing, but obligate interreliance on your partners? And so this is why I'm interested in these behaviors. So these behaviors are called social transfers. This is when there's a material made in one body that gets passed into another body where it acts. Okay? And so this includes things like milk or eggs or fluids involved in reproduction that bring about direct responses in receivers, bypassing sensory organs. And so the stuff that's transferred is called socially transferred materials. And so there are all sorts of different ones out there, but generally you find these socially transferred materials passed in only extremely important fitness-relevant behaviors, things like mating and reproduction or different forms of care. And generally these materials don't evolve unless it's good for the donor to make them, and the behaviors don't happen unless it's good for both parties to make those behaviors happen. And so typically these things are first evolving for one reason. So for example, to transmit genetic material or food or something, or microbes. But then over evolutionary time, they become more and more complex and sometimes manipulative. So genetic material, nutrition, and then these are termites who have very important bacteria that live within them and that they wouldn't work without these bacteria. So it's very important they transmit them one to another. And so there's an enormous diversity of social transfers out there and socially transferred materials. And here you can see different ways in which they vary. So, some of these are really incredible, bizarre behaviors. So if you have never heard about reproduction in snails, I highly recommend you read about it. But they involve something called love darts. So snails are hermaphrodites, and so they can act as both male and female. But which one they do first is important for who is going to be bearing the costs of reproduction. And so along with their mating, they stab each other with love darts, which they shoot into the other partner, which changes how they do their fertilization and the input. So incredible romantic life. On the other hand, you have things like spiders, which will just leave a packet of sperm, and then the female might just encounter it and say, I'm going to make some babies. So there's incredible variety of different things. And they vary in how related the partners are, in how synchronous these behaviors are, how frequent or sustained they are. And generally, along these various axes, you get the sense that there are some of these behaviors that are more cooperative and some that are a little bit more conflictual. And these social transfers can have enormous evolutionary implications. So think for a moment about our own evolutionary history as placental mammals. So very, very long ago, there was a group of creatures who started burrowing and having their eggs in burrows, and somehow over 100 million years or so, there evolved something like milk that is secreted to these little eggs in some burrow or something. And then we have a branch of these early mammals that led to the monotremes, things like echidnas and platypus, where they lay eggs still, external to their body, and those eggs hatch, and they have little patches of skin that secrete something like milk. Not a nipple, but a little patch of skin. And there are certain genetic signatures we can see of the egg pathways sort of breaking down in some cases. And then in marsupials and placental mammals like us, we have this transfer by the egg, so losing importance, and we have this increasing importance in lactation across all mammals. And then specifically in these branches, we have a shift towards something like the placenta, in particular in our branch. And so some of the genes that were passed in the highly complex milk of marsupials and monotremes becomes less complex in us because actually a bunch of the functions get taken over by the placenta. So you don't need to do all that stuff in the milk anymore. Anyway, this is amazing. It probably led to our success because we have no other extant lineages other than us from that point. So good job, milk. And now every single mammal relies on milk at some point in their biology. And so this social transfer is what led us here. And there are other amazing social transfers. And so for example, if you think about the calcified eggs, that was also a major thing for conquering terrestrial environments. But what really excites me about social transfers is that it allows something called metabolic division of labor. So this is the partitioning of a metabolic process into elementary parts that are performed by separate entities within a cooperative group. So what do I really mean by that? So metabolism. So metabolism is actually this, but fundamentally it's how you turn external food into new biomass or to maintain yourself. How do you make babies out of food? It's a really hard thing. Like, can you imagine? How would you possibly do that? But actually our bodies do that because each of these little things is a little cellular piece of machinery, a little protein that does a change, that makes something change. And we have to power all of these reactions in our bodies to make this all happen. A simpler way of viewing this is this, okay? So hamburger in, person out. And each of those things requires energy. So you need to power each of those reactions. You need to make each of those little machines. Now imagine if instead of having to do all of it yourself, somebody else would do some of it and then pass you an intermediate, and then you just started halfway through and you didn't have to make everything. Amazing. That'd be great having a shortcut like that. Well, it turns out that's what we do, right? That's what a lot of these social transfers provide, is this metabolic division of labor where mom eats that hamburger and processes those goods, turns it into something that's easy for the baby to deal with, and then the baby can work on growing instead of having to do all of that labor. And so this is fundamentally a decoupling across time and space and individuals between resource acquisition and use. And you find it in all sorts of different situations. Here I have a praying mantis who he is doing the work of eating, and then he gives of himself to the female as she eats him. So the social transfer I study is this one. This is called trophallaxis. It's also a form of social regurgitation. It happens across ants, bees, wasps, termites, but it evolves independently in each of those. And here, yay, it works. So this is a video of ants drinking from a fluorescent food source. These are honeypot ants. You see all of their larvae? I'm going to see if I can maybe make it fast. Let's see. So this is at the beginning, and then about 18 hours, this is about 4 hours later. You see everybody's drinking this fluorescent food, and it passes further and further around the nest into more and more individuals as they share this material across their community. They also have really dynamic larvae for ants, just for larval. Anyone who cares. Yes, and so fundamentally this creates this social circulatory system across the colony of ants. So they're sharing all of this stuff over their community, over this mouth-to-mouth regurgitation. And so we can actually eavesdrop on what they're passing around and see they're passing around all these different molecules. And so it's sort of like this social fluid is transmitting more than food, it's transmitting physiology and uniting the colony by this shared physiology across them. And we can see all sorts of interesting signatures in there. We can tell, if we collect this fluid from an ant, we can tell whether she was old or young, whether she's from a really big colony or a small colony, a lab colony, a field colony. And now I'm going to tell you a few brief stories. I'll see if I can try to go quick through them. So some species do this behavior and some don't. And we wanted to figure out why. So if we look, this is a phylogenetic tree of ants where you have different genera all around the side. And in mint, you have genera where they do this behavior, and in pink where they don't. So you see it's a total mess. And we wanted to know why. This is with my PhD student, Marie-Pierre Merville. She's now finished, and now she works on predicting the weather. And so there are all these different traits that correlate loosely with whether they do this behavior or not. But still nothing makes sense. So if an ant drinks sugary liquids, they should do it. If they have a sting, they probably shouldn't do this social sharing. If they have large colonies, they probably do. And if they're from these older, sort of more, this branch of ants, they don't. So we made up all of these different hypotheses for what could really make sense for why this is happening. And then we built sort of diagrams for what led to what. So for example, in eco-opportunism, the idea is that as the terrestrial environment changed, and there are more and more plants, angiosperms that are flowering plants that have like nectar and other sugary fluids, and there's more and more aphids that are drinking from those plants and secreting things, there's an opportunity, and maybe ants were taking advantage of this opportunity. And all the other correlations we saw are just because that came first. Anyway, we tested all of these things and we found two of them made the most sense based on how these traits propagated over the phylogeny. And basically what we see is that when they started drinking these sugary liquids, the ants started doing this behavior. And also, when the workers started being more committed to the colony, they also started doing this behavior. And when the workers kept their own reproductive capacity, they wouldn't do this behavior. So if you also, once they gained this behavior, then that meant that the ants that did started becoming more biodiverse. So the new species outweighed the species that went extinct. And so then when we put all the data together, we can see that when you have a reason to share and a willingness to share, then you build a new social transfer. And I will go so basically, so you gain this new social transfer. Then what happens? What can happen after that? So one thing we find, as I mentioned, you have these large colonies in species that do this behavior. And they often have big social complexity, like giant queens, different sized workers, things like that. How does this happen? So you can have big differences between queens and workers, or you can have queens and workers that are the same size. This is called dimorphism. And across the ant phylogeny, you have enormous variations, some that are huge queens, tiny workers, and some that are really the same. And so with my student Arthur Matt, we set out to understand this. So we have these egalitarian ants and these inequality ants. And one interesting thing is that they feed their babies differently. So in the egalitarian ants, they kind of bring in a cricket or something, they put it down, and they say, go for it, babies. And then while in the inequality ants, they feed their babies in one-on-one interactions. This food for you. this food for you. And we thought maybe that's the key. And so Arthur found these old papers from George and Jeanette Wheeler where they looked at all sorts of ant larvae and classified them into different shapes which had different traits. And some of these shapes and traits seem to be more associated with being a passive larva, like this guy. Can you imagine this guy being active? No. This guy, active. And so putting this all together, we could see that when you had a predatory ant and a predatory diet, then they changed to this derived diet with the sugary liquid or something they had to process. That meant that the ants necessarily had to change how they fed their babies. And so when they changed food, that meant they had to change how they fed their babies. And once they did that, then they started evolving these types of passive behaviors and passive morphologies in their babies. So the shift away from predation led to passive larvae. And then we found that there's clearly a correlation between species with passive larvae who have higher dimorphism. So as soon as the babies become passive and they accept whatever they're given, then you can build them into very different morphologies. And we find all these links with social complexity. How does this happen? What is the outcome? Fundamentally, what we found was that this enhanced care that led to passive larvae was a cause of the social complexity that evolved later on. So this led to big colony sizes and worker polymorphism and things like that. So increased care led to increased dimorphism, which increased social complexity. And there are plenty of other interesting implications, socio-political implications that I'm not going to talk about. So in my way, I did become a detective, getting to study all of these amazing patterns in biology. And maybe, given now, maybe I still managed to be a little bit of an actress. So I thank my group, especially these folks, and all my funding and collaborators, and I thank you for your attention.